was one of those nights where the cold seemed to seep straight into your bones. Everything felt heavier, like the darkness itself was pressing down on me. The streetlights flickered every few seconds, their glow weak and unreliable. The city, usually noisy even in the dead of night, was eerily quiet. When you're homeless, nights like that are the worst. You're already invisible to most people, but on nights like this, it feels like the whole world has forgotten you exist. I was wandering the streets, looking for somewhere to rest. All the usual spots were taken: doorways, bus benches, even underpasses. Nobody made eye contact. That's kind of the rule out here. You don't look, you don't talk, you just survive. And then I saw her. She was sitting at the edge of an alley, hunched over under a flickering streetlight. At first I thought she was just another person like me, someone down on their luck. But as I got closer, I realized something about her wasn't right. She didn't move, not even a little. Most of us fidget or shiver or adjust our stuff, but she was perfectly still. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and her hair hung in thick, tangled strands around her face. Something about her posture, though, it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Hey," I said, stopping a few feet away. "You okay?" She didn't say anything at first, just sat there, her head tilted slightly down. I was about to walk away when she slowly looked up at me. I froze. Her face was pale, like too pale. Her skin was stretched so tightly over her cheeks that I could see the shape of her skull, but it was her eyes that really got me. They were empty, not in the usual way, like someone's just tired or sad. No, these were hollow, like looking into two deep, dark pits. I took a step back, my stomach twisting. She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that makes you feel better. It was cold, almost like she was mocking me. "Don't go down that way," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I followed her gaze toward the alley behind her. It looked normal, dark and a little sketchy, but nothing unusual for this part of the city. "Why?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. She didn't answer. She just kept staring at me with those hollow eyes, and then, as suddenly as I'd noticed her, she was gone. I stood there for a moment, staring into the empty spot where she'd been. My heart was racing, and my breath felt shallow, like I couldn't quite get enough air. The alley looked the same as it had before she spoke, quiet, dark, a little too still, but now it felt wrong, like there was something waiting in the shadows. I told myself I was being ridiculous. She was probably just messing with me. Still, I decided to take a different route. No point in risking it. The city felt even quieter as I walked. Every sound, every gust of wind or creak of a sign made me flinch. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her following me, but there was never anyone there, just shadows and the occasional stray cat. Eventually, I found an empty spot behind an old diner. It wasn't much, but it was out of the wind, and the smell of stale grease gave me some weird kind of comfort. I leaned against the wall, pulled my coat tighter around me, and tried to relax. But I couldn't stop thinking about her. Who was she? How had she disappeared so fast? And why had she warned me about that alley? I didn't have answers, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted them. But those hollow eyes and that cold, mocking smile wouldn't leave my mind. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. My eyes shot open and my body tensed. The footsteps were coming from the direction of that alley. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, I heard a whisper. "You shouldn't have looked." My chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I grabbed my backpack and scrambled to my feet, ready to run. But when I looked toward the alley, it was empty. No one was there. Yet somehow, I knew I wasn't alone. The next night, I was back on the streets, trying to forget about that strange woman. Her hollow eyes and warning kept playing over in my head, no matter how hard I tried to shake it off. But out here, you can't let fear get to you. Fear gets in the way of survival. I stuck to my usual routine, scoping out places to rest and searching for anything to eat. But as I walked, something felt off. The city wasn't just quiet, it felt dead, like even the rats and stray cats had disappeared. And then I saw her again. She was standing this time under a dim streetlight across the road. Her thin figure swayed slightly, as if she were about to topple over. I froze. My gut told me to keep walking, pretend I didn't see her. But curiosity got the better of me, or maybe it was stupidity. Either way, I crossed the street. As I got closer, her movement stopped, and she turned to face me, her head tilted just like before. "You again," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice came out shaky. She gave me a faint smile, the same unsettling smile I remembered. "You stayed out of the alley," she said softly. "Yeah," I replied. "What's the deal with that alley? Why'd you warn me?" Her smile faded. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," I pressed. For a moment she just stared at me with those empty eyes. Then she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There's a safe place, near the church on 5th. But don't stay too long." "A safe place?" I repeated, frowning. She nodded. "Go there, and stay out of the alleys after dark." Before I could say another word, she turned and walked away. Her figure melted into the shadows, and within seconds she was gone. I don't know why I decided to listen to her. Maybe it was the way she said it, like it wasn't just advice but a warning, or maybe it was because the word safe sounded like a lifeline. I made my way to the church on 5th. It was late and the streets were colder than usual, the kind of cold that feels alive, sinking into your skin and staying there. Behind the church, I found a building I'd never noticed before, even though I'd passed this area countless times. The sign above the door was faded, the letters barely legible. St. Augustine. I pushed the door open, half expecting it to be locked, but it creaked inward easily. Warm air hit me, along with the faint smell of soup. For a second, I felt like I could finally relax. Inside, rows of cots lined the walls, most of them empty. The place was eerily quiet. The only person there was an old man sitting behind a folding table near the entrance. He looked up as I walked in, his pale blue eyes sharp despite his tired expression. "Looking for a place to stay?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yeah," I said. "Is it safe here?" The question felt dumb as soon as I said it, but he didn't laugh. His face grew serious and he leaned forward slightly. "Safer than out there," he said, motioning toward the door. Then, after a pause, he added, "As long as you don't go looking for trouble." "What kind of trouble?" I asked. His expression darkened. "You've heard the stories, haven't you, about the disappearances?" "Disappearances?" He nodded slowly. "People like us, disappearing without a trace. It's been happening for years, mostly after dark, mostly near the alleys." My chest tightened. "Do they know what's causing it?" The old man glanced at the door, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. Then he leaned in closer and lowered his voice. "They call it the Night Watcher," he said. The name sent a shiver down my spine. "What is that? Some kind of person?" He shook his head. "I don't know what it is. No one does. Some say it's a man, others say it's something else. All I know is, if you hear footsteps behind you at night, don't turn around. And for God's sake, stay out of the alleys." I left the shelter not long after. I didn't feel comfortable staying there, even with the warmth. Something about the old man's story unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I told myself it was just an urban legend, a scary story to keep people cautious. But as I walked through the empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The fastest route to where I usually searched for food took me through an alley. I stopped at the entrance, staring into the darkness. The old man's words rang in my ears. "Stay out of the alleys." But I was tired, and the shortcut would save me at least 15 minutes. I told myself it was fine, just a quick walk through, nothing to worry about. The alley was colder than the street. My footsteps echoed off the walls, each step louder than it should have been. I shoved my hands in my pockets and kept my head down, trying to ignore the strange stillness. Halfway through, I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't mine. They were slower, heavier, and came from behind me. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my chest. The alley was empty. No one was there. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I turned and hurried out of the alley, my pace quickening with every step. Even when I reached the street, the sensation lingered, like something was still following me just out of sight. When I finally made it back to my usual spot to sleep, I couldn't relax. Every sound, a creak, a gust of wind, made me jump. The old man's warning echoed in my head, louder than ever. If you hear footsteps behind you, don't turn around. The next few nights were worse than usual. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. It started small. My shadow didn't always match my movements. Sometimes it would lag, or I'd catch it moving when I wasn't. I told myself it was just the flickering streetlights. Then there were the whispers, soft and faint, like someone speaking just behind me. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. And my stuff, I'd wake up and find it moved. My coat, my backpack, even my cans of food, they'd shift ever so slightly, like someone had been rummaging through them. I thought I was going crazy until I ran into Sam. Sam and I weren't exactly close, but he was one of the few people out here I could talk to. He looked worse than usual when I found him near the old train tracks one night. His hands were shaking and his eyes darted around like he was expecting something to jump out at him. "Do you ever feel like you're being watched?" he asked, not even saying hi. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, lately, yeah." Sam let out a shaky breath. "I've been seeing something. It's not normal." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. "I saw it near the overpass a couple nights ago. It's tall, like freakishly tall, skinny with these long arms and legs. I thought it was just my imagination, but then it started following me." My stomach twisted. "Did you get a good look at it?" Sam shook his head. "No, I ran, but I felt it, man, like it was breathing on me." The hairs on my arms stood up. "You think it's real?" Sam gave me a look. "You don't." That conversation stuck with me. If Sam was seeing and feeling the same things I was, maybe I wasn't imagining it. Maybe there really was something out there. A couple of nights later, we decided to investigate. It wasn't like we had anything better to do, and the fear of not knowing was eating at us. We started with the stuff left behind by Tony, a guy who used to hang out near the docks. He'd been missing for weeks, and his pile of blankets and clothes hadn't been touched since he disappeared. As we sifted through his things, Sam pulled out a crumpled map. It was torn at the edges, with a red circle drawn around an old warehouse on the edge of the city. "You think he went there?" I asked. "Maybe," Sam said. "Or maybe he was trying to tell someone else to." It was a long shot, but it was the only lead we had. The warehouse was falling apart. The windows were shattered, the doors rusted and hanging crooked. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "This feels like a bad idea," Sam muttered, shifting nervously. He was right. Everything about the place screamed, "Don't go in." But we went anyway. Inside, the air was cold and stale, with a faint metallic smell that made me think of rust or blood. The floors were covered in debris, broken glass, old newspapers, and piles of rotting wood. But it wasn't the mess that got to me. It was the symbols. They were drawn on the walls in thick, dark strokes, like someone had used charcoal or ash. They didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. As we moved deeper into the building, we started finding things. A single shoe covered in dust, a torn jacket, a wallet with no ID, just a couple of crumpled bills. "These belonged to someone," Sam said, his voice low. "Someone who didn't leave on their own," I replied. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The metallic smell grew stronger and the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us. Then we heard it. A dragging sound, faint at first, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Sam froze, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding. The sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from the hallway ahead where the shadows were deepest. "Let's go," Sam whispered, his voice shaking. We turned to leave, but before we could take a step, a door slammed shut behind us. The sound echoed through the building, rattling the wall. And then we saw it. It stepped into the light. A figure, impossibly tall and gaunt, its limbs long and thin like tree branches. Its head tilted to one side, as if it were curious about us. Its eyes, or what should have been its eyes, were hollow, dark pits that seemed to pull the light from the room. Sam grabbed my arm. "Run," he whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted for the exit, our footsteps echoing like gunshots in the empty building. The dragging sound turned into heavy, deliberate footsteps, matching our pace. When we finally burst through the doors and into the night, we didn't stop running until we were a good block away. We leaned against a wall, gasping for breath. "Well, what was that?" Sam stammered, his face pale. I shook my head, my hands trembling. "I don't know, but it's real." Neither of us went back to the warehouse after that, and we didn't talk about what we saw, but from that night on, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was, because wherever I went, I could still feel it, watching. After the warehouse, my life fell apart. I couldn't sleep without seeing it in my dreams, the tall, hollow-eyed figure standing there, watching. Even awake, I felt it, like it was lurking just out of sight. Every sound, footsteps, creaking wood, whispers, set me on edge. I couldn't relax, couldn't think straight. And then Sam disappeared. I found his stuff abandoned near the train tracks. His jacket was folded neatly over a crate, and his backpack lay open on the ground. The only thing out of place was a torn piece of paper, scrawled with shaky handwriting. "It's watching me." I shouldn't have looked. My stomach sank. I knew exactly what had happened, and it was my fault. If I'd never convinced him to go to the warehouse, maybe he'd still be here. But he wasn't. And I knew if I didn't do something, I'd be next. I went back to the warehouse. It was stupid. I knew that, but I couldn't just sit and wait for it to come for me. If I was going to die, I wanted answers first. The building looked worse than before, like the air around it had grown heavier. The windows were darker, and the door creaked louder as I pushed it open. The metallic smell hit me immediately, stronger than last time. I stepped inside, the floor groaning under my weight. Everything looked the same. Rotting debris, strange symbols on the walls, but the place felt different. Darker, colder. "Sam!" I called out, even though I knew he wasn't there. The only response was the echo of my voice. I made my way deeper into the building, retracing the path Sam and I had taken before. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, like they were alive. Then I saw it. A staircase leading down. I swear it wasn't there last time. It spiraled into darkness, the air growing colder with every step. I hesitated, staring into the blackness below. But something pulled me forward, a mix of curiosity and dread I couldn't resist. The stairs ended in a narrow hallway, the walls damp and streaked with something dark. The smell was unbearable now, thick and metallic. At the end of the hallway was a door. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking. When I opened it, I stepped into a room that made my heart stop. It was massive, like some kind of underground chamber. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dark. The floor was littered with stuff, shoes, backpacks, jackets. I recognized some of it. Tony's backpack, Sam's jacket, a single shoe I'd seen someone wearing weeks ago. And in the center of the room, it was waiting. The Night Watcher. It was taller than I remembered, its limbs impossibly long and thin, its head tilted to one side. Its hollow eyes locked onto me, and I froze. It didn't move. It didn't have to. Just the sight of it sent waves of terror through me. "You," I whispered. "What are you?" It didn't answer, but in that silence, I felt it. It wasn't just a creature. It was something worse, something ancient. It fed on fear, on loneliness, on despair, It thrived on people like me, the forgotten and invisible. And the woman I'd seen before, she wasn't a warning. She was part of it, another victim it had consumed. I don't know what came over me, but I decided I wasn't going to let it take me. My eyes darted around the room until I spotted an old lantern on the floor. I grabbed it, my hands shaking as I smashed it against the wall. The fire caught quickly, spreading across the debris on the floor. The flames climbed the walls, swallowing the glowing symbols. The night watcher didn't move at first. It just tilted its head as if amused. But as the fire grew, it let out a sound, a scream so loud and inhuman it felt like the air itself was shaking. I ran. The hallway stretched on forever, the heat from the fire at my back. I stumbled up the stairs and burst through the front door just as the building went up in flames. I stood in the street, gasping for breath, watching the warehouse burn. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A shadow. It was faint, barely there, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. The night watcher wasn't gone. It never would. And somewhere deep down, I knew it was still watching me. I thought burning down the warehouse would be the end of it. For a few days, I actually believed it. The nightmares stopped. I didn't feel like I was being followed. I stayed as far away from that part of town as I could, not wanting to see what was left. But the feeling came back. It started the same way as before, a constant sense of being watched, even in broad daylight. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd see a shadow shift when nothing was there. The whispers returned, faint and fleeting, just enough to make my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, just leftover fear, but deep down I knew better. One day I started asking around. I didn't mention everything I'd seen, but I casually brought up the fire. "You mean the old warehouse?" one guy said, leaning on a shopping cart filled with junk. "Still standing. Walked past it yesterday." My stomach dropped. "No, it burned down, I saw it." He gave me a strange look. "Don't know what to tell you. It's still there." I heard the same thing from a few others. The warehouse hadn't burned. Some of them acted like I was crazy, others shrugged it off, saying the place was cursed. I didn't go back to check for myself. I couldn't. By now, I wasn't sleeping much. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it waiting for me in the dark. I moved shelters constantly, trying to outrun the feeling. It didn't matter. Wherever I went, it followed. One night, I found a spot in a small shelter on the edge of town. It was quiet, just a few rows of cots in a dimly lit room. I stretched out, telling myself I just needed a little rest. For the first time in days, I started to drift off. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, steady, and way too loud to belong to anyone in the room. I froze. My heart pounded as the footsteps came closer, stopping right beside my cot. The air turned cold. That crushing, suffocating weight settled over me again. I turned my head, barely able to breathe. There it was. Tall, gaunt, its head tilted to the side, just like before. It didn't move. It didn't have to. Because in that moment I understood. The night watcher doesn't let go. It just waits. Homelessness is scary enough, the cold, the hunger, the loneliness, but what I went through, it's something I'll never forget. I don't know if I made the right choices. Would you have gone back to that warehouse, or would you have just run? Have you ever had that feeling like someone was watching you, even when you were sure you were alone? It's the worst kind of fear, like you're being hunted and there's nothing you can do about it. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt that way. The truth is, I don't think it matters if you run or fight. The night watcher doesn't stop. It doesn't let go. It just waits. If this story made you think or gave you chills, leave a comment and tell me what you would have done. Would you have confronted it? Would you have burned down the warehouse? And if you want to hear more stories like this one, make sure to like the video, share it with a friend who loves a good scare, and subscribe. Trust me, this isn't the only story I have to tell.